This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. This Friday's show begins with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan joins us to discuss the differences between La Niña and El Niño weather patterns and their expected impacts on global production. He also talks about the unique future market conditions that we are currently experiencing. Also ahead, Extension Food Safety Specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri, Londa Nwadike, joins us to discuss community-supported agriculture programs. These programs, more commonly referred to as CSAs, have evolved over time, but to this day mainly allow for producers to cover upfront costs thanks to the support of their consumers. We end with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond for this week's agricultural weather report. Chip highlights the beautiful weather experienced by most of the state this past weekend and the system impacts we can potentially expect in the week ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien for this week's grain market update. And before we get into things, Dan, as always, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Samantha. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And we're going to mix things up a little bit today. We're going to start with some weather pattern updates, which has been a common theme through our conversation over the last year or so. But we really wanted to emphasize the La Niña weather pattern versus the El Niño weather pattern, because right now, the past 3 years, we've been in La Niña, and that has implications in terms of the drought conditions we've kind of seen in the past year for sure.
Yes, I've had some graphics that can help support our conversation. So we've been in a La Niña weather pattern, I should say it. Obtained these graphics from the USDA Ag Outlook conference held a week ago. Of course, we're looking at ag commodity markets. Then the rainfall issues, both in the United States and globally, are just of paramount importance. So anyway, you see the La Niña rainfall pattern that we were talking about. And if we kind of focus on the United States, on South America and Australia, there's a bunch of other places we could talk on. But if you focus on those, the La Niña weather pattern of the last 3 years certainly seems to have played out. You look at the southern U.S. generally being dry, and we in Kansas, the Western Corn Belt, we felt that. Relatively decent moisture in parts of the Central Corn Belt. We've seen in this last year, the year that we're in, dryness in Argentina, southern Brazil, and that would be certainly consistent with this La Niña rainfall pattern. Wetness in northern South America, particularly some of the crop production areas of Brazil. And so in this latest USDA WASDE report that came out earlier this week, we chopped dramatically Argentina corn and soybean production and held steady record high levels in Brazil. So very consistent with this situation. In Australia, we've had record high wheat production for 2 or 3 years now, particularly this year. So I guess the patterns we see here projected in this La Niña rainfall map really hold well. But then if El Niño does come about, you've got some other factors at play. Again, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it.
For our friends that are just listening, these maps can be seen in the information that you put together every single week in terms of grain outlooks and market updates. So if you're wanting to find that, you can find that information on Ag Manager, which is linked in our show notes today on agtoday.net. So check that out if you're listening and want to follow along for sure.
That's right. So those 3 areas we talked about, the United States, well, suddenly in an El Niño situation, the areas that had been dry, well, they're projected to be wet. And, of course, that would affect Kansas and Nebraska, et cetera. It affects your old home area in the Gulf Coast, as I understand it as well. They're starting to see some of these patterns, aren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, my parents keep telling me, and I continually check the weather in different areas that I've lived in. So Auburn, Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama. And it seems like they haven't been able to get out of rainy conditions, which is normal for this time of year, considering we're used to a bit more rain this time of year in that area. But this year, it just seems like almost every day there's rain.
Well, Chip Redmond in our shop could talk about the transition from La Niña to El Niño, but it seems that at least in that situation, that there be some consistency what we're seeing. And probably the thing for us to watch for our corn and soybean markets would be basically the flip-flop that happens in South America typically. The areas that had been wet with La Niña, well, now they turn dry, and that would be a fair chunk of the productive areas of Brazil. And what had been dry now turns wet, and there you see parts of Argentina that are affected by that. the Australians really watch El Niño and La Nina closely. The last 3 years, they've had large crops. We've heard nothing really of major fires occurring. Prior to that, when we were in an El Niño pattern, if you remember their historic events, some major fires that were occurring there. Well, we go into El Niño, as you can see on this map, there's projections of dryness in just about everywhere but the western part of the country. And it's something of great concern to them. If you're looking closely at all these other parts, you probably are watching Europe, the Black Sea region, to see what the impact of El Niño would be. And there you can see wet January through April and dryness and other parts of that. Current situation, we just had very dry year or two in Germany and some of those areas, very consistent with this map of what La Nina would bring about. So now we're anticipating a shift. Things could change yet. The weather will do what it wants, but we're going from, as you see on the screen, a La Nina with the odds of moving towards an El Nino, and it has a big impact on moisture availability. And if it's impacting moisture in key crop production areas around the world, it's affecting the markets.
For sure. And while we're welcoming El Nino weather patterns here, it is key to keep in mind that the impacts it will have on a global scale, because it does negatively impact other areas, like you mentioned, Australia being one of those, and the northern portion of South America as well. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. And I'm sure that'll be frequent in our conversations to come to as this kind of switch continues to happen, like we've already mentioned seeing in some parts of the country already. But thanks, Dan, for that update and those great visuals. So once again, everybody, if you're wanting to see those maps, you can find the link to them on agtoday.net. So be sure to check that out. But now getting into kind of our normal place that we start, a bit of a reversal here. Our futures markets in the past week or so, did we really see anything change too much?
Well, we're in a situation where we've seen just so-so movement in the markets. We came out of the March 8th WASDE report, and generally there were no explosive moves in the markets. So here on Wednesday, the 8th, at the end of the day, of that trading day, you in essence saw D's corn at $5.58. It is noteworthy that we had been at $5.95 not that long ago. So in general, we're thought to be a bit negative in terms of a downward trend, but still $5.58. In my thinking, seasonally, we're at a point where we're coming into March. We're just about to get into fieldwork times. So far, the market has no focus on that at all. We're only focused on international export numbers. In fact, if there's anything that's probably affecting the corn market right now, it's that we've had just so corn exports in the U.S. Well, it won't be too long to where we're focusing on, yes, corn exports, ethanol production, and also what's going on in the field. And that's probably going to change the dynamics. At the end of the day, for soybean futures, on the same day as that report, we closed at $13.71, down about 2 cents. Again, no really explosive moves there. Kansas City wheat closed at $7.91, and we've lost 40, 50, 60 cents in the wheat market of late. I think the question is, does rain make wheat? We've had rain, we've had moisture in northwest Kansas, but it's not all over the state. And so we'll see where all this goes. I think, so we're into March. This is when we typically break dormancy. And so we'll go from March now into April, May. We'll be watching closely what happens with those crops. And we'll see where we're at from there. But again, wheat exports have been just so as well. High value of the U.S. dollar, strong export availability from some other key countries. Again, we talked about Australia, record high crops. Russia, some pretty strong supplies. The UN working to keep whatever we can grow in Ukraine, moving into international channels. With all of that, we're seeing not a lot of things that give market watchers for wheat much to bid on. To me, that it's a conundrum, because the numbers came out of that USDA WASDE report, tightened up world stocks again for wheat. So we're tightening up. Each time out, we get a chance to look at where we're at for wheat, and we're tighter and tighter down to near record historic levels. But we've lost 50 cents in the wheat market. So I think our focus is on what's right in front of us, which I understand. And in a situation like this, you probably will have to see actual cash market movement lead the futures out of whatever situation it's in right now. And we'll see what happens over the next 3, 4, 5 months, particularly as break dormancy in wheat and see what people's prospects and expectations are for supply demand heading into the balance of 2023.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess the markets are taking a one step at a time approach right now, which makes sense. It's a slow period, like you mentioned. So just a lot of things that we're waiting on, it seems like, to see how they play out. Those dynamics at hand, a little different than what we're used to.
Well, yes. And if you look at these contracts on the futures complex, they're typically pretty front loaded in that we have most of our trading volume in the upfront lead contracts. So what happens in those lead contracts tends to have an impact on what happens later on. I would say, particularly in the corn market, when we have had volatility of late, upfront contracts have probably double the price movement of the latter ones. So that to me that's a good thing in that we're responding with old crop in terms of demand, et cetera. But for new crop, we're still trying to figure out what's going on. 558. For corn, 1371 for soybeans, still 791 for hard red winter wheat for the harvest contracts. Those aren't bad prices, but they're not as high as they were last year. So we're in March. We'll see where April and May takes us when we start bringing in the field issues all that much more.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough for joining us today for this grain market update. As always, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Samantha. Take care.
You as well. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's grain market update. We're about to cut to a short break, but when we return, we'll be back with Extension Food Safety Specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri. Londa Nwadike joins us to discuss community-supported agriculture programs, more commonly referred to as CSAs. She joins us to share insight on how they have evolved over time, but to this day still allow for producers to cover upfront costs thanks to the support of their consumers. After that, we'll be ending today's show as we always do on Fridays with our K-State meteorologist, Chip Redmond. For this week's agricultural weather report, Chip highlights the beautiful weather experienced by most of the state this past week and what we can expect really in the week ahead. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Londa Nwadike. She is the State Extension Food Safety Specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri. And she's joining us now for another conversation on local marketing. But this time we're going to be talking about CSAs, otherwise known as community-supported agriculture. So, Londa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, like I said, I feel like most people know CSAs as the abbreviation. Not many really know what it stands for, community supported agriculture. So when we hear CSA, what does that really mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the thing is, with a lot of terminologies related to local foods, there's not necessarily like a set definition, and nobody's enforcing the use of the terminology necessarily. So people will use it differently. But the idea, of course, just like you said, is community supported agriculture. So I think traditionally when community supported agriculture first kind of started, maybe like the mid 90s, I would say 1990s, then it was a little bit more like consumers would pay in advance for a membership in that CSA. And then, then the members would receive a share of the products of that farm. And then quite often there would be a work requirement that like if I wanted to buy a membership in that CSA, then I would need to work on the farm for a few hours or whatever to kind of help contribute, which, of course, there's a lot of great benefits to that. If you're living in a place where you can't necessarily grow a lot of food, then you could have that opportunity to go out and, meet your local farmers and support them and, see what they're growing and all those things. But I think today there's a number of different ways that CSAs happen and that CSAs work. So sometimes they also will use the term like subscription farming. So subscription farming typically would not have a work requirement, but would maybe they'll charge like an advance fee for the entire season, or sometimes maybe even the consumer will just pay per box of food that they get. So there's a number of different models, I guess, is a short answer. But the idea is really that the customer is helping the farm maybe up front with some costs because, farmers have to pay for inputs. They got to pay for the plants and they got to pay for if they're using any sort of fertilizer, their plant protection products that they might be using and labor costs, so the farm has a number of costs involved in producing that food. So this model typically kind of helps the farmer a little bit up front with those costs and just will help the consumer to be able to see where their food is coming from and to connect with the farmer that's producing their food.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a way I never even thought about CSAs before. I guess how they are, a bit different from farmers markets. You're still supporting, a local farm at a farmers market. But with CSAs, like you said, you're kind of helping with those upfront costs that a lot of producers, sometimes they're having to put debt towards getting started and then paying that off as the season goes on. So that's a great differentiation between the two there.
Yeah. And again, there's always kind of a number of different models that CSAs could use. And part of the idea is that, the producers are sharing some of the risks with the members, with the subscribers, or, with the people that are part of that CSA. Because unfortunately, farming is not without risk. There's weather that could happen, hailstorms or windstorms. There's insects or other pests, wildlife damage or whatever there might be. So then ideally the customer can help to mitigate some of that risk for the producer, or there's a late freeze and you lose all your peach crop or something like that. That's, obviously very devastating for producers. So, there's kind of a way of hopefully mitigating some of those risks by using a CSA model.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because with each box, a lot of these subscription services, it's kind of, obviously seasonally, it's different food that's being produced. And sometimes it's a surprise almost. So you get a diverse diet from participating in these CSAs as a consumer, but you're also helping support a local farmer, like you said, mitigating some of that risk and helping with upfront costs. So it's a great win-win situation for both.
Yeah, definitely. I was just thinking the same thing that, as a consumer, I know when I shop at the farmer's market, for example, especially if I go with my kids, they like peaches, they like sweet corn, they like strawberries, there's those things that they know, that's what they want to buy. Like they don't necessarily want to buy like a rutabaga or, something that they might not be able to identify what it is. But with the CSA model, again, there's different models, but quite often the producer will put a box together and, will put whatever they have in there. And then, you as a consumer come home and there might be artichokes or something that you just hadn't really cooked before. But K-State Extension and MU Extension, actually, they work together. They have what I think is a great resource. It's called Seasonal and Simple. So it's a website that has, handling instructions for all these different fruits and vegetables that are grown locally. It also has a listing of farmers markets. So if you're looking as your consumer and you're looking for farmers markets in your area, there's a listing of farmers markets on there. There's recipes, how to use those different products. So that's huge. Like if I have never cooked with artichokes or rutabagas or whatever it might be before, I can find some recipes on that website that are healthy and, using local produce, that I can use to make something healthy for my family and tasty. And then there's also like preserving instructions and so on. If you did want to freeze or can those foods, there's instructions how to do that safely. So that's a great resource, both for the farmer selling the products. So if customers don't know what to do with that food, the producer can share that with the customer so that they can do something with the food that they're buying.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a great marketing opportunity for sure too. Even at farmers markets, if you have something that's not selling and maybe it's a bit unique, like a radish or something that maybe people don't have as much of a taste for, they think. But if you were to say, hey, there's this resource with great recipes on how to cook with this, a great opportunity for sure. Exactly.
Yeah. I know even for myself, you kind of know how to cook what you know how to cook. And I think there's some people out there that are more adventurous cooks, but not everybody is always like that. So, we do try to provide resources for people to try other healthy local fruits and vegetables so we can support our local farmers. And, eating healthy is always important as well.
Well, that's a great resource. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes of today's program, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. But if listeners are tuning in, Londa, and they're thinking, well, these CSAs sound great, but how do I actually, start one? Are there rules that I need to follow? Legislation that is put in place to protect me as a producer sort of thing? What do producers really need to know when they get started?
Yeah, so CSAs would be considered a direct-to-consumer sale in Kansas. So they would fall under the same regulations as food safety regulations as a farmer's market would. So K-State has a publication that we update every year The number that K-State uses is MF3138. So if you go to our K-State Extension bookstore, the title is something like Selling Foods at the Farmers Market Regulations and Food Safety Best Practices. But that publication, it's a 16-page publication, so it's longer, but there's a lot of information in there on all the different products that you might be interested in selling and what the requirements are and how to, sell it hopefully as safely as possible. So that publication will help you as a producer to know, what the regulations might be, particularly if you're wanting to sell things in addition to like fresh whole fruits and vegetables. Then fresh whole fruits and vegetables they don't need licensing and so on. But if you're wanting to sell prepared food items or value-added items, then you have to pay more attention to the regulations. So actually, University of Missouri Extension, the other half of my job, they just came out with a nice publication on selling through local markets. And so Market Channels for Locally Raised Foods is the title of that one. And so there's information there too about CSAs and just a little bit on how to get started, how to get going on a CSA. So there's some resources available there that hopefully could help you get started. And, there's a number of direct marketing conferences that are national direct marketing conferences that, would provide information on things like CSAs and, so you can network with people from other states to get ideas from them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Networking, a huge part of these community-based direct-to-consumer selling opportunities. You need to get plugged into a community to actually start building your own. So that's a great resource for sure.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too, thank you for mentioning that because I thought about the Kansas Specialty Crop Growers Association really helps to connect like specialty crop growers, so fruit and vegetable producers and others across the state of Kansas. So their website is just kscga.org, I think, but it's KSCGA anyway. So that's another great resource to be able to connect with other growers, especially crop growers in this case. And they have like a members only Facebook page that I know gets, a decent amount of traffic because I'm part of that. And so that's a good way that people can ask each other questions and share information and, learning from other growers is always beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wonderful, Londa. This conversation has been so interesting and so insightful. I'm sure listeners feel the same. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Londa Nwadike. She is the State Extension Food Safety Specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri. If you're listening to us on the radio and are afraid you're going to miss out on our next segment because you're reaching your destination or have something else that you're having to switch to quickly here, don't forget the Agriculture Today programming is also available as a podcast. Our podcast is easily accessible on all podcasting platforms, including our website, agtoday.net, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can simply search us on any podcasting platform, Agriculture Today, Kansas State, and we are more than likely to pop up and you can follow us there. That way you can simply have us pop up in your regular feed on whatever platform you're using and listen to us more regularly that way. Once again, you can easily access that on agtoday.net or any podcasting platform by simply searching Agriculture Today, Kansas State. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's show as we always do with this week's agricultural weather report. And joining us for that this week is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. So Chip, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the weather this past week, we had a beautiful weekend, but that didn't really continue on through the entire week.
Yeah, hopefully everyone enjoyed it while it lasted. It was fairly short-lived, but we had much above normal temperatures that resulted in 70 degrees across a lot of the state. And, that really helped warm things up, especially the soil. But we have to remember that we are still in a transition part of spring, in the early part of spring. And as a result, we need to be vigilant that we're going to get weather like we're getting right now, a very cloudy, overcast, drizzly days, because we've been spoiled a little bit.
Yeah, that 70-degree day was beautiful, and I hope, like you said, everybody got out and was able to enjoy it. But really quickly after that, it wasn't, a cold snap per se, but things did seem to appear more like they would in March. So cooler temperatures and then some precipitation a little bit for parts of the state?
Yeah, we keep getting these small amounts with each little wave or system that crosses the plains. We're stuck in a stagnant pattern somewhat of a stationary front well to our south, so it keeps us in the cooler air, but it's cooler. It's not significantly colder, so any precipitation we're seeing is falling mostly as drizzle and light rain, which is good because the ground can soak it up. We're not seeing that convective thunderstorm activity, but unfortunately, very spotty amounts and nothing overly widespread. While everyone has seen drizzle for the most part, we've seen up to a quarter inch in north central Kansas and a quarter to a half inch in far eastern Kansas, especially with that first wave that we saw on Tuesday into Wednesday. So no big amounts of moisture, but just enough in places to hit average for the week. And unfortunately, the southwest and south central, for the most part, didn't really see much measurable moisture, so they continue to add in their deficits, unfortunately.
Sure. And the week ahead, I know we're anticipating another system, hopefully that'll be a bit more impactful. Are we going to see that in southwestern Kansas, like you mentioned?
Well, the impact might not be in the best way. It looks like right now we're going to warm up in early next week and break these kind of stagnant temperatures. And we'll see temperatures approaching that 70-degree mark, especially for southwest Kansas. And then we'll have thunderstorms develop along a pretty strong cold front. That'll hopefully bring some moisture for there, but typically these don't bring moisture for far west Kansas. We saw a deviation from that end of February, and they got lucky. And I just don't see that continuing or likely with this system. At this point, it can still change. We're pretty far out. Models have not been handling these systems very well. We've got a very, very active pattern for west of us and in California and into even western Colorado. But unfortunately, that's taken most of the moisture to our west and then north and even east. And I think that trend will continue for the most part, keeping those folks in exceptional drought dry for another week.
Sure. So not good news in that regard. But in terms of kind of temperatures that we expect to see in the week or so ahead, are we going to be a bit below normal? Is that what you were mentioning before we got on air?
Yeah, the models all had this week being pretty substantially below normal, but they've really backed off. And now we're expected to get more near normal, so slightly a degree or two below normal. So definitely not an Arctic cold blast by any means. However, we will see a brief warm-up early next week, and then once that stronger cold front comes through, we'll go ahead and see temperatures a few degrees below normal for the upcoming week after that. But I just don't see a significant cold snap, which is good, so things are starting to green, especially for eastern Kansas.
And for the soil temperatures that we mentioned earlier on, right?
Yeah, soil temperatures are coming up pretty quickly, and the vegetation's responding as a result. And when we look at soil temperatures, they're getting close to the 50-degree mark, especially in southern Kansas. So a little ways to go yet, but we're definitely seeing spring progress.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, I can't thank you enough for joining us today and for the update that you've provided.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for this week's Agricultural Weather Report. That concludes this week's programming. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.